You're listening to Let's Talk Creation with Todd Wood and Paul Garner, the creation show where we learn, grow, and worship.
Well, welcome to another episode of Let's Talk Creation with Paul Garner and Todd Wood. I'm Paul Garner.
And I am Todd Wood.
It's great to have you here again, once again, for our podcast. Pull up a comfortable chair, get yourself a coffee, sit back and relax and enjoy our latest episode. Today, we're going to be talking about the mysterious Denisovans. I don't know very much about the Denisovans. I know a bit, but Todd is going to reveal all. So hang around for that. So we're looking forward to that. But don't forget, before we get on to the topic today, to subscribe, like and share our episodes, tell your friends about us, leave us a positive review, drop us a donation, all of that stuff. It's great. Helps us to keep going, helps us to keep the audience growing, and we really do appreciate it. So thank you very much for all your efforts in helping us spread the word. Okay, now, today, long-time listeners to this podcast will know that Todd has an interest, nay, an obsession with hominin fossils.
It's true.
He has published lots and lots of papers on this subject, interpreting the human fossil record from a creationist perspective. And of course, we've talked about lots of those studies already here in previous episodes of the podcast. Most recently, of course, we had our trip to the Czech Republic.
Right.
That was about 6 months ago.
Yeah. Seems like forever. I mean, it's about time we got back to some of this stuff.
Well, I was just about to say it seems 5 minutes ago. It didn't seem long since we were there in Czechia, but
Yeah.
yeah, I mean that was a great trip, and we of course went to see the famous Lucy fossil, and we saw the Salam skeleton, and we also visited that Paleolithic site out in the rural parts of Czechia at Dolní Věstonice, and that was great. Where we were thinking about mammoth bone pits and all of that kind of stuff. Anyway, we thought we should come back to this topic of human fossils because there have been some really interesting recent developments in a story that started way back in 2008. A story that was made possible by the genomic revolution, which has brought to light the existence of a population of people that are now known as the Denisovans. And we thought that it would be great to sort of talk through this story together because it really is quite fascinating. So Todd, why don't you kick us off by telling us what makes this story so unusual?
Yeah. Everything. I think this is one of the most interesting stories in anthropology. Right up there with who did the Piltdown hoax and the smuggling of the disappearance of the Peking man fossils. There's a lot of great stories in anthropology, but this one is up there. So sort of put this into context, I think back to the discovery of the Neanderthals, say in 1856, that first skeleton discovered by mine workers in the Neander Valley in Germany. And it was partial skeleton, but it was especially the odd shape of the skull cap that kind of alerted people then that there was something odd going on, that this was not just a person living nearby recently. This was something strange. And everything that we've learned about Neanderthals kind of flows from that original discovery, right? You find a bone that looks weird, and then everything comes out of that. And there has been a lot that we've learned about Neanderthals, hundreds of different individuals, multiple occupation sites, lots of their technology, their ability to make tools, composite tools, artwork, all of that came from, hey, this skull looks weird. That's where it started. But the story of the Denisovans is kind of the opposite. It's kind of the inverse. So it starts in a cave in central Siberia called Denisova Cave, conveniently enough. So the cave had been on the radar for quite some time. There are deposits there that they knew contained old remains, and there were a lot of tiny broken bone fragments that looked like they had been chewed up by a predator. Some of them looked like they had been through the predator's digestive system. Here is one of them. I have one here. Here is one of those tiny little bone fragments, and you can see that's nothing, right? That's not terribly interesting at all. And I should say, yeah, and I should say this is not actually one of them. This is a scan and a print. So just in case somebody's going to get confused here, this is a scan and a print of an actual bone fragment. But that's the size, right? That's how big they are. Super, super tiny. So, and what do you do with that, right? And in past generations, that would be junk. That would be garbage. You wouldn't pay much attention to it. Certainly, you couldn't tell what bone this comes from, and you couldn't tell, certainly couldn't tell the species that it came from. That was beyond our abilities in past generations. And you could probably say, oh, a predator lived here because look at all these chewed up bone fragments. But that's really all you could have done. But in the past 30 years, we've seen a complete revolution in our ability to understand genome level science. And that's produced this massive database of protein sequences, right? So protein is the stuff the genome gets translated into, parts of the genome. So genomes are DNA and they get translated into protein. And so there's thousands of proteins coded by a typical genome. And so we had all these, with the genome revolution, we had thousands of these protein sequences, thousands, millions, billions at this point. And so with that, then you could find a protein sequence and you could match it to one of those proteins in the database. And they the researchers use a technique called mass spec or mass spectrometry to take small fragments of protein that are possibly preserved in a tiny bone fragment like that. And they can identify the sort of creature that it came from, right? So suddenly, what was garbage, basically, junk cluttering up a site, became valuable material once again. Because we could tell, oh, this one came from some kind of deer, right? Or this one came from some kind of goat. You could narrow it down to that. And of course, these could be extinct creatures, so they might not be exactly the kinds of goats or deer that we have alive today. But you could tell that it was some creature of that sort. But then once in a while, very rarely there in the Denisova Cave, you would hit on a protein that came from something that looked like it was human. And that's where our story kind of starts to get interesting.
Okay. Now, before we kind of get into the story and think about what they actually found, why don't we just take a step back and talk about the cave? Mm-hmm. Okay, you mentioned that these fragments were found in a cave.
Yeah.
It was in central Siberia.
Mm-hmm.
So what can you tell us about the cave, about the actual location where these finds were made?
Yeah, so it's a cave in the Altai Mountains of Central Asia. It's within the territory of Russia. but it's quite close to the border. It's about 50 miles east of the border with Kazakhstan, and it's about 200 miles northwest of the border with China. And that connection with China is going to be interesting as we develop the story here. There are a couple of Street View 360 photographs that have been uploaded to Google Maps. We're going to link to those in the show notes so people can go check it out for themselves. You can you get a 360 degree view from the outside, looking at the parking area and the cave itself, and then you can get a 360 view within the cave, within the opening chamber of the cave, and you can see what it looks like. And it's also part of a cluster of sites there in the Altai Mountains that are the known sites of Neanderthal occupation. So Okladnikov, for example, is just 24 miles to the north, and Shagarskaya Cave is about 66 miles to the northwest. If you heard the news recently, you might have heard about the Neanderthal dentistry. That might ring a bell. That was Shagarskaya. That was a tooth from Shagarskaya. So this area, obviously, we've known for a long time that Neanderthals lived there. We've been interested in studying the cave deposits of the area. Anthropologists have been doing that. So that's why there has been this interest in even trying to figure out, what these tiny fragments are, right? What are these fragments? Well, we know there's Neanderthals in the area. We know there's stone tools in Denisovan as well, in Denisova Cave as well. So, so that's why there's the interest. That's where it's situated. Right there, sort of on the convergence of Russia, China, and Kazakhstan.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Google Earth is great. I mean, you just mentioned there that there's a parking area outside the cave. I mean, you can drive up to this.
You can,
cave.
yes.
I mean, is it open to the public, or is it just a closed scientific site?
There is a wooden walkway that like a deck that leads you up into the cave, and the 360 view within the cave. There's walkways in there as well. So presumably it is open to the public to go looking if you want. So if you happen to be in central Siberia, in the middle of nowhere, you can hire a car and drive out on that gravel road and see Denisova for yourself.
Yeah, amazing.
You're willing to take the risk.
Amazing. Yeah, yes. I mean, I'm not very familiar, obviously, with that area. I don't know much about the borderlands of Russia and China and Kazakhstan. It's not an area I've ever visited or know very much about. But as you say, we will definitely put the locations in our show notes, and people can go and check that out on Google Maps. That's very helpful. But let's come back then to this story. Those bone fragments they found in the cave, that were found to have human proteins. What happened to them? What did they do with those?
So obviously, you shave off a bit of the bone to get the protein out, and you find out, ooh, this looks like it could be human. So you're going to want to do the DNA sequencing, right? And this area, it wasn't just a matter of, hey, there's a bunch of Neanderthal sites in the area, but it's Siberia, right? So it's cold. And we've known for a very long time, this was one of the things that was established, when I was still a grad student, I think. People were doing research and discovering that DNA had a better chance of being preserved in colder environments than in warm environments. So stuff down in Spain, that's harder to get DNA out of than stuff that's from, say, Siberia. So obviously you get bone fragments you're going to want to, that you think are human, you're going to want to start sequencing. And so researchers went in and they started sequencing some of these bone fragments, looking for essentially Neanderthal DNA. That was the expectation. These are Neanderthal sites. They have Neanderthal type stone tools. So we're going to get some Neanderthal DNA. So they were surprised. So they first sequenced a piece of DNA called the mitochondrial DNA. That's a piece of DNA that exists in high copy numbers in your cells. Your cells typically have a single set of your chromosomes, your nuclear chromosomes, your nuclear DNA, but your mitochondrial DNA can be many, many, many times that. So if you're looking for, what's the most likely DNA to survive in the environment for a long time, mitochondrial DNA is the way to go. So they started sequencing that, and they got this tiny bone. Okay, so I've got here a representation of the tiny bone that they were looking at. It was a broken piece of this bone right here. Tiny, tiny bone. This is the distal phalanx of your fifth finger, which is this finger right here. It is essentially the tip of your pinky finger, right? And the bone wasn't even intact. It was just the joint end, that end right there, that had broken off. The actual tip of the finger there had broken off, and all that was left was the joint end, which is this part right here. So this is how tiny that bone was when they started sequencing. And what they found was a mitochondrial DNA sequence that did not match Homo sapiens. It was not an exact match there. It did not match chimpanzee. Definitely didn't match chimpanzee. But it also didn't match Neanderthals. It was something quite different, right? So, okay. And what that showed, well, the original paper was sort of guarded. I remember they published this in March of 2010. And the initial judgment was sort of guarded. This could be an interesting maybe a new hominin species. We don't know. Now that first report gave a few important details about this population. They did find some teeth in Denisova Cave that also had mitochondrial DNA that matched the DNA from the tiny finger bone. Okay, so they got a couple of teeth. And what was surprising about them, they were molar teeth, and they're huge. They're very large grinding surface, which was unusually large for Homo sapiens and unusually large for Neanderthals. Okay, so by December, they had published the nuclear DNA from the same fossil, right? So now we have a nuclear genome from this population as well. And they found then that nuclear DNA was actually more similar to Neanderthals than to modern people, which suggested that this was like a cousin of the Neanderthals. And then they found, remarkably, that the similarities between Denisovans and living people from Melanesia was higher than any other modern human population, especially people from Papua New Guinea. Okay, so let's rewind here a second and think about what this means. So I mentioned, you get the Neanderthal skeleton discovery in 1856, and it's the skull shape that sort of alerts everyone to something weird is going on with these bones, and then everything comes out of that, right? All that we've learned about Neanderthals comes from that first recognition of bones that don't look like anything we've seen before. Here, everything is going backwards, right? We have bones and bone chunks that don't look like anything important. Why would you think that was important? No one would think that tiny little bone was important. But because of the molecular techniques, now we can discover that, in fact, this bone contains DNA that looks nothing like anything else we've seen before. So now we have, effectively, by the end of 2010, we had a population that known largely from their DNA that was in search of sort of a fossil identity. We didn't really know what they looked like exactly, other than they had big molars. But that's it, right? What do you do with that? It's a fascinating story. As I said, this to me ranks right up there with some of the more crazy stories of anthropology. So,
I mean, that's amazing, because, as you say, it's sort of upside down from the way that things usually proceed in paleontology. You usually find some fossils, and then you might be hunting for some genomic evidence associated with the fossils. That sometimes happens.
Yep.
Like Homo naledi.
Yeah, absolutely.
We've got fossils.
Fossils first.
And it would be great. Yeah, fossils first. And it would be great if you could get some kind of molecular data from those fossils as well. But here it's the other way around. And so that's kind of amazing. And I guess with, all of these genome tools available to us now, perhaps that kind of thing is going to happen more and more.
It could, yeah.
And you read about this idea of, researchers looking for environmental sort of DNA.
Oh,
where they're kind of looking for DNA in soil samples, sediment samples. You even get ecologists, who are looking at DNA in water samples and all of this kind of stuff. So you can find the DNA before you find the organisms, or before you find their fossils. And that's sort of amazing. I want to just go back to that question of the Melanesians just for a moment. So you mentioned that Denisovan DNA was more similar to Melanesian DNA than any other living human population. Why is that? I mean, that's an obvious question. Why?
So basically the procedure they did there, comparing different populations of modern humans to the Denisovan DNA, was the same they used when they got the Neanderthal genome. And there they found that people of Eurasian descent, so people from Europe or Asia or Native Americans, shared more DNA in common with the Neanderthals than did the Neanderthals with, say, people from sub-Saharan Africa. And because Neanderthals are essentially a Eurasian population, we know, I guess the closest they got to Africa was the Holy Land, right? We have Neanderthal fossils from various places in Israel. But otherwise, they're a Eurasian group. And so it makes sense then that, well, maybe sometime in the deep past, some Eurasian Neanderthals, as Homo sapiens started, encroaching on their territory, they did what people normally do. You either fight or you make friends, right? And so that's what they did, and they had children together. And there you go. Biologically speaking, we call it interbreeding, but I know some people are a little uncomfortable with such crude technical statements about people, but there you go. That's what they were doing. They were interbreeding. And so now people of Eurasian descent have little bits of Neanderthal. And then my genome, I've had it, I had it tested, and sure enough, I've got quite a bit of Neanderthal DNA in me. Paul, I don't know if you've had your genome done, but
I haven't, but I guess it would be the same with me.
Given that you are British through and through, you're going to be part Neanderthal as well.
Yeah, that's right.
So then, translate that to the Denisovan Melanesian connection. The result seemed to be that the Denisovans had interbred with the ancestors of the modern Melanesians. And just for reference, if listeners and audience members are not quite familiar with Melanesia, that's an area of the Pacific that consists of the island of Papua New Guinea and various other islands there that are northeast of Australia. So the Solomon Islands, Fiji, Vanuatu, those are all Melanesian.
Yeah. Yeah. Good. Now, in the history of creationism, we've often thought about hybridization, so the crossing of two species, as evidence that the parents belong to the same created kind, right? So
Yep.
interbreeding, if you want to use that term, evidence of belonging to the same kind. Is that the same conclusion that we can sort of come to here? Is the fact that these Melanesian ancestors and the Denisovans interbred or intermarried, is that evidence that the Denisovans are also human like the Melanesians?
That's exactly what I would conclude from that. Even without knowing what the Denisovans exactly look like, the DNA evidence to me is pretty conclusive. Now, I say that not wanting to hang my hat on any one piece of evidence, right? I'm a scientist. I like to have multiple confirmations. I don't like to draw conclusions from just one evidence, but it's an important evidence. Genome sequences are important evidence, and so it ends up being kind of compelling. But something was going on there. So Denisovans, they looked different from us. And we knew that at the time because of their big molars, but just based on, Neanderthals look different from us. So I would expect Denisovans to be the same. But as far as the genome evidence suggests, they were probably human just like we are. So that's how I would take it.
Yeah. Now, you've mentioned that there are offspring from Neanderthals and modern humans kind of interbreeding, and we've also got Denisovans and modern humans interbreeding. That raises the question: could we find evidence of Denisovans and Neanderthals interbreeding?
Oh, funny you should ask. So this is chapter 2 of the most amazing story in anthropology. All right, so we know there was that kind of interbreeding. And this also came out of Denisova Cave. So they continued testing all these little bone fragments. They continued excavating more in the cave, and they found a tiny fragment. So I've already showed you this tiny fragment as an example of the size of the bone. Here it is again. This is the tiny little fragment. And this one, why would I have a copy of a unformative, boring looking tiny little fragment from Denisova Cave? What's the big deal? Well, I'm about to tell you. So this happens to be Denisova 11. And some of you probably know the significance of that. If you don't, here comes the story. Okay, so they sequenced the DNA from Denisova 11. And they found that it contained equal amounts of DNA from a Neanderthal and from a Denisovan. And the DNA from each group, the Neanderthals and the Denisovans, they were evenly distributed across all of the chromosomes. And that indicated that that individual had a full set of chromosomes from a Neanderthal and a full set of chromosomes from a Denisovan. The individual also had as much DNA from the X chromosome as from all the other non-sex chromosomes, which tells us that she was biologically female. Based on the development of the bone, too, they determined she was probably a juvenile, probably not yet fully adult. So she was a girl. Had one parent that was a Neanderthal and one parent that was a Denisovan. And then the mitochondrial DNA turned out to be Neanderthal. And because we know that mitochondrial DNA is transmitted from mothers, then we know that her father was a Denisovan and her mother was a Neanderthal. So that's Denisova 11. And it's named Denisova 11 because it's the 11th fragment of a Denisovan found in Denisova Cave, but it's really extraordinary. It's a really terribly important fossil, even though it's just this useless little piece of junk because it's a first-generation hybrid. It's the first time we've found a first-generation hybrid in all of the ancient DNA sequencing that we have done. And it's direct evidence that Neanderthals and Denisovans were, in fact, having children together. And, yeah. So it's one thing to look at our genomes today and see little bits of Neanderthal DNA there and think, oh, somehow Todd Wood had a Neanderthal ancestor somewhere in the distant past. It's quite another thing to find the remains of a person who was literally half and half. That those parents were, that one was a Denisovan and one was a Neanderthal. Yeah. So the implication that we see in our modern genome is kind of confirmed by this little fragment right here.
Amazing. It strikes me that Denisova 11 is a surprising discovery because, like you say, to find a first generation hybrid, that seems like that would be unusual. Am I right? What are the odds of finding a first generation hybrid?
Yeah,
among these little bone fragments, these little scraps of bone that I presumably, in years gone by, they'd have probably just been stuck in a drawer somewhere in a museum, wouldn't they? And probably not paid much attention.
And some of them might not even have been excavated. They might have been excavated and lost. They might have been thrown in the dump pile. Who knows? Yeah, I think it's really surprising to find a hybrid. But then again, maybe not. I don't know. So thinking about Neanderthals, we have some, 500 individual Neanderthals that have been discovered, at least partially. You hear about some of them that have weird characteristics where the researchers think, this might be a hybrid individual. But I haven't heard very many of that. So then we've been sequencing a lot of the Neanderthal fossils looking for DNA. And so, yeah, here you come to Denisovans. We've got, at this point, when this was published, less than a dozen of these things discovered and sequenced. And one of them turns out to be a hybrid. Whereas we've got 500 Neanderthals and we've been sequencing those since we started sequencing. And only, we've never found a first generation hybrid there. So that does seem rather surprising. Then again, on the other hand, Denisovan fossils are identified primarily molecularly at that point in 2018 when this was published. And that's how you identify the Denisovan fossils. So that's not the case with Neanderthals, where we have, the shape of the bones and we can tell, oh yeah, this is definitely Neanderthal just by the characteristics that it has. So there's a lot more intense scrutiny to sequence Denisovan fossils because that's the only way to find them. So it may be that there's just hundreds of Denisovan fossils sitting in museums that have just been misidentified, right? And we haven't really looked at them and tried to sequence them. So, yeah, I don't know. But on the other hand, running out of hands, but on the other hand, there really has been a lot of DNA sequencing done on Neanderthals. There's been a real push to do that. So, yeah, it really does, at the end of the day, it really does feel like this is a remarkable discovery. The idea that you could find a first generation hybrid just strikes me as wild stuff. And even if I just ignore all the, how many fossils we have and all that jazz, just think about the nature of populations, right? For there to be a recognizable Denisovan genome that's recognizable as Denisovans, then it theoretically has to be separate from, there has to be a separate development from Neanderthals and from Homo sapiens, so that you can see that, this is uniquely Denisovan. But then if you have hybridization happening frequently enough that you actually find a first generation hybrid in the fossil record, and that would suggest that how are they keeping separate, right? Because if they're frequently hybridizing frequently enough that you can find hybrids in the fossil record, then that would suggest that that would be breaking down the molecular differences between them. It's all very complicated, but it does seem to me, any way you slice it, that finding a first generation hybrid is incredible and amazing, and an amazing piece of fossil detection, and astonishing that we could find something like this. There you go.
Yeah, and I think, we haven't really talked about this in this episode, but thinking about that sort of post-flood context and these populations, maybe this gives us some kind of insight into, what exactly is going on with these populations of humans in that sort of immediate post-flood world. So with all of those caveats, and there seem to be lots of caveats that you've sort of thrown in there, this does seem to be extraordinary. Maybe not, but
Probably.
Probably. Yeah. Now, when we opened this episode, you said everything about this story is unusual.
Yeah.
And that seems to have been the case so far. Have we got to the end of the story? You've got some more surprises to tell us.
Oh no, there's more surprises. It's about to get even crazier. So let's start with, are there Denisovan fossils outside of Denisova Cave? Is there any way that we can find fossils that could tell us what these individuals look like, right? So the original Denisovan finger bone was discovered in 2008, right? And that's when they began to sequence it. Then 2010, we get the genomes published in March and December of that year. And then obviously the additional hybrids or additional fossils were found, including the hybrid girl. That was published in 2018. That same year, a couple of teeth from a place called Cobra Cave in Laos were announced as potential Denisovans based on their size and shape. That's now Cobra Cave in Laos. That is on the other side of China. It's down on the southern end of the border with China, but also kind of close to China. A year later, in 2019, we got a real breakthrough. At the time, I was pretty excited by it. This is a reconstruction of that breakthrough. This is the Xiahe mandible. The mandible was originally found in 1980, and protein analysis of the mandible revealed that it was probably Denisovan. And sure enough, the molars are really big, which is what we expected. This part of the jaw here, where the tooth sockets are, is just massive, which is what I would expect from something that had such big teeth. So there was a lot about this that was exciting at the time. But again, it's just a broken mandible. I mean, there's not much to it. So in 2025, we got another mandible that had been dredged out of the Taiwan Strait. That was also identified based on protein analysis. That was called the Penghu mandible. And here's another funny wrinkle. It had been dredged and offered for sale in an antique shop in 2008. And so it was purchased then from that shop and then donated to the National Museum of Natural Science in Taiwan. And that then was another re-examination of existing fossils looking for evidence that they might be Denisovans. So again, as I said, we could have lots of Denisovan fossils sitting in museums somewhere that we just don't know they're Denisovans because we didn't know to look for them, right? And so here we're sort of starting to see that. We have this Tibetan Xiahe mandible that was found in 1980. We have this 2008 Penghu mandible that had been in the museum collection in Taiwan. And you can start to see a geography starting to form, right? So Penghu in Taiwan, you're looking at continental island that would have been quite close to China. Laos there, just on the other side of the border from China. And of course, the original Denisova Cave, which is just on the other side of the border from China. China seems to be the central place for these guys. And maybe we should be looking more carefully at those fossils that had been collected in China. And there are many of them. And they have been admittedly strange. Some people have tried to say, well, these are Homo erectus. Other people have said, I don't know about that. Lots of different opinions about Chinese fossils, which is really interesting. So maybe a bunch of those are Denisovans and we just don't know it.
Yeah. So there are these additional discoveries, but they're basically teeth and jawbones. It sounds like.
Yes,
and the molars. Yeah. So the molars are all large, which kind of is consistent with the original Denisovan discoveries. So okay, that's interesting, but it's still not terribly informative in the sense that what we really want to see are skeletons and skulls. Yeah. We sort of want to see, what do these people really look like?
Right.
So do we have any other clues, hints to the answer to that question?
We do. So, and this is the best part of the story, in my opinion. So this goes back to 1933. In northern China, the Japanese were occupying China at the time. And as usually happens when one country invades another and tries to occupy the territory, it's not favorable to the people being occupied, right? So they don't like what the occupiers are doing. And there was generally this feeling that the Japanese were going to loot cultural treasures from China and take them back to Japan. That was one of the reasons why they tried to hide the Peking man fossils, right? And so that packing up of the Peking man fossils and putting them into a truck to smuggle them out of the country. That's the last time anybody ever saw them. And we don't know what happened to them still. So anyway, this is in the middle, we're ramping up to World War II here. So there was a Chinese man working for the Japanese occupation near a city called Harbin. And he was working on a bridge across the Songhua River there. And as I mentioned, the Peking man fossils were well known at the time in China. They had been found just a few years earlier in the late 1920s. And I say well known, they were famous. The Chinese were immensely proud of the Peking man fossils, right? There had been fossil discoveries coming out of Europe for years. There had been fossil discoveries coming out of Africa for some time by that point. Southern Africa in particular. And of course, you have Dubois' discovery of Homo erectus in Southeast Asia. So when China got their fossils, the Peking man fossils, it was a big deal. So everybody knew about them, right? So the man finds the skull as he's working on this bridge, and he recognizes that it's not obviously like his skull, and he figures this must be important. But being a good Chinese man, loyal to his country, he wasn't about to turn it over to the occupiers. So what do you do? Well, he hid it in a well He hid it in a well. And then after the war, after World War II ended, Japan was defeated, he didn't tell anybody. He didn't tell anybody for decades. So when he was very old then, it became clear that he was about to pass away, he finally told his family that story. Maybe it came back to him in his old age. Oh yeah, I remember that now. Whatever. I don't know how that happened. We're not given his identity in the reports. We're just told this story. So his family finds out about this story, and so they start asking him all questions about, where did you put this and where was this? And in 2018, the third generation of his family went looking for it. And sure enough, based on his description, they found the well where he'd hidden the bones, the skull, and 85 years later, they recovered it. So it's insane. It's a completely crazy story, but wow. And here it is. So this is that skull. This is a three-dimensional reconstructed model of the skull. This is not actually a scan of the skull. This is based on photographs of the actual skull itself. And I will put a link to this model in our show notes so that people can go and check this out for themselves. It's pretty neat. So anatomical detail on this, I don't know about that. But general shape and form and size, oh yes, definitely. This is quite good. So as you can see, it's a big skull. I don't know that you know that it's a big skull, but it's a big skull. And in many ways, it has the sorts of typical attributes that you would expect from a hominin skull. So it's got the big heavy brow ridge here that we've seen before, got a very low forehead. It's quite long and not very tall. These are all the sorts of things that we would expect to see sort of in a really old hominin. So when the researchers first published a description of the skull, they definitely noticed how big the teeth are. So we can turn it upside down here and you can see there's one tooth for sure that's left in this skull, and it's pretty big. And so they already thought when they described the skull, they thought, yeah, this could be Denisovan. They did an analysis of the similarities of various skulls that had been found, and sure enough, they found it was quite similar to the teeth of the Shahe mandible, which we know is Denisovan. So they described this skull as a new species. They called it Dragon Man, and the scientific name, they called it Homo longi. And that name comes from Longjiang, which is a name for the region where it was found. And it basically translates to Dragon River. So there's a reason they called it Dragon Man, and there's a reason they call it Homo longi. It makes sense. Now, yeah, so as I mentioned, it showed up, the teeth showed up quite similar to the teeth of this Shahe mandible, which suggests this could be Denisovan. Other similar fossils included the Dali cranium, which was found in 1978, Jinyushan fossils, which include other skeletal elements besides the skull, and then the Hualongdong fossils, which include bones from multiple individuals, and all of those bones are Chinese individuals. So the plot thickens. This might be this fossil skull here that spent 85 years hidden in a well from occupying Japanese forces. This could be, in fact, the face of a Denisovan at last. Maybe.
So, does this story end then with a definitive identification? I mean, is the Harbin cranium a Denisovan?
So yeah, the mitochondrial DNA was published in the summer of 25. They recovered it from the dental tartar of the fossil. That one tooth there had some tartar on it. They were able to scrape that off and grind it up, and that is what preserved the DNA. And sure enough, it is definitely Denisovan. So the Harbin cranium is in fact that face we've been looking for. And thanks to that patriotic Chinese man who was not about to give an important discovery to the Japanese, we have this skull and a great story, a really great story. It's just really amazing. Now that doesn't mean that all the skulls that are similar to this one are in fact Denisovan. Except, of course, they look a lot like the Harbin skull. So Dali and Jinyishan and Wolongdong, obviously those will have to be tested with molecular techniques and verified as being Denisovan. But in my semi-amateur view, I'm thinking there's a particular the form of the brow ridge here is very distinctive in Denisovans. It has a very distinctive look to it. That is in fact in these other fossils. So my expectation is they're going to turn out to be Denisovan as well. So when the Harbin cranium was first published, it made the cover of National Geographic. I was going to get my National Geographic out to show you, and I forgot. Sorry, but we will link to that reconstruction. They put a reconstruction made by John Gurche on the cover, and we will link to Gurche's website in the show notes so that you can go and look at that image. And remember, as you look at it, hairstyle, the details of the reconstruction are imaginative, but as far as the shape goes, Gurche has a very meticulous method for reconstructing the shape of the face itself. So yeah, eye color, no, and hair style, no, but the shape of the skull, yeah, that'll give you a pretty good idea of what they look like. And so that's the story. As it stands today, as far as I know. I don't know if there's any big news to be published this year or not. I'm not in on that, but it's crazy stuff. You go from garbage fossils that you would never think were important to massive genome breakthroughs that reveal the existence of these amazing fossils, and then a hybrid, a first generation hybrid. Who would have thought that? And then finally a face from a skull hidden from, war occupiers and hidden in a well for 85 years. It's got all the wonder of an Indiana Jones movie somehow. I don't know. It's somewhere in there, I think.
Yeah. Lots of twists and turns. I mean, it's a remarkable story. I'm kind of surprised in a way that you waited this long to tell it on the podcast, because it's really interesting. We're going to have to wind up very, very shortly, but I mean, any final comments about all of this, Todd?
Yeah, I've been sitting on this story for a while because it's been such a crazy thing wanting to tell it. But anyway, just this spring there's been a report of dental proteins from Chinese fossils that were attributed to Homo erectus. That's the first time that I know of that Homo erectus fossils have been analyzed using molecular methods. As far as I'm aware, actually, scratch that. They've probably been analyzed, but I don't think they've been successful, or they haven't been published. And they looked at a variety of these Homo erectus fossils, putative Homo erectus fossils from China, including the famous site of Peking Man. There have been additional excavations there which have turned up a couple of other pieces of bone and tooth and so forth. And they found in this protein analysis a variant protein that was common in Homo erectus and was found at least in one Denisovan fossil, and then is known from 21% of modern Filipinos. So we have the first hint that maybe there has been interbreeding with Homo erectus in the past, if that is, in fact, what these fossils are. So it looks like the Denisovans were having children with Homo erectus, and then those hybrids were having children with the ancestors of the Filipino population, maybe. Anyway, that's the model that they put forward. And I think that report, it's, again, very early, very preliminary. Don't read too much into it. But it certainly is consistent with the creationist perspective that has been developing for also 30 years now. Then that would, it would confirm what we've been saying, that Homo erectus is also fully human. And as I said, that's, we've been saying that since the early 90s, at least, looking at the skeletal and cultural evidence left behind by Homo erectus and thinking this looks like a human being. So yeah, that Chinese tooth study is at the very beginning. We don't want to get too carried away with that. But it's consistent. We've been saying this. So that's it. That's all I got for the Denisovan story. If there's more big developments, obviously we'll come back and do another episode, but I think we've had quite a good time here telling the Denisovan story.
We will definitely come back to more twists and turns in this story if they develop. But that will have to be the last word for now. We're definitely out of time. So yeah, so thanks for filling us in on that. I've certainly learned a lot about Denisovans. I'm sure our audience has too. So thanks everybody for joining us on this episode. Hope you enjoyed that. Give us a like, give us a follow, a subscribe, whatever it is. And we will see you in a fortnight. We'll be back here same time, same place, and we hope you'll join us then. So we'll see you in 2 weeks' time.
See ya.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Let's Talk Creation. For more information, visit us at letstalkcreation.org, where you'll find an archive of past episodes and all our show notes. If you'd like to leave a comment or make a suggestion, you can find us on all the major social media platforms. Let's Talk Creation is brought to you in the U.S. by Core Academy of Science and in the U.K. by Biblical Creation Trust. As a listener-supported ministry, we are grateful for all of your financial support. Find out how you can make a contribution at our website, letstalkcreation.org. Also remember to like, subscribe, and share this episode with your friends. Thanks, and see you next time.